Earlier this week, the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee. Under Secretary Mayorkas' leadership over these last 2 years, we've seen more than 4.8 million migrants encountered at the southern border. We've seen deadly drugs pouring into our country, killing more than 108,000 Americans in a single year. And there's no question but that the transnational criminal organizations known as the cartels are fueling the chaos and the destruction. When Attorney General Merrick Garland testified before the Judiciary Committee just a few weeks earlier, I brought up the role that the cartels were playing in this ongoing crisis. I asked the Attorney General if he was familiar with the business model of the cartels. Flood the border with migrants, overwhelm law enforcement, and then allow the movement of the illegal drugs across the border and into the interior of the United States. Attorney General Garland said yes, he was aware. Not only that, he highlighted actions that he had taken at the Department of Justice to crack down on these operations. Earlier this week, when I posed the same question to Secretary Mayorkas, I asked if he was familiar with this tried and true strategy of the cartels. And he was clueless. He said, "I'm not aware of any such strategy." Well, Mr. President, I don't know how that could possibly be true. This is a well-known tactic that's been used throughout Secretary Mayorkas' tenure. One of the most notable examples was in 2021, when the small town of Del Rio, Texas, all of a sudden was flooded with 15,000 migrants from Haiti. 35,000 people live in that small town, and they were overwhelmed by the huge volume of people from, I know it's hard to imagine, but from Haiti. To state the obvious, the Del Rio Border Patrol sector doesn't have the capacity to process or care for that many individuals at one time. In an attempt to help, the administration moved agents from other checkpoints to the sector where the surge was happening. But after all, that's exactly what the cartels had hoped for. As there was a surge of agents to Del Rio, that left other portions of the border unprotected. Administration officials later told congressional staff that this massive surge of migrants was a coordinated effort by the cartels. They directed Haitian migrants to a single location so that other areas would be left uncovered and clear a path for their illicit trade. Officials from the Biden administration admitted that this surge was coordinated by the cartels, but yet the Secretary of Homeland Security is unaware? How could that possibly be? Well, Secretary Mayorkas is either trying to deceive the Senate, or he's completely unaware of the reality on the ground. I think both of those are fireable offenses. Either you're lying or you're completely oblivious to the threat to public safety posed by the current crisis, which is singularly of the making of the Biden administration and their unwillingness to use the tools that they have, the laws that already are on the books, in order to deal with this crisis, this humanitarian crisis, this public health crisis. So every day the United States is getting played, and criminal organizations whose illegal businesses are making them a lot of money are getting richer. These groups are what I like to call commodity agnostic, because they deal in any product or service that makes them money. They really don't care. They certainly don't care about the migrants who are frequently abused, and many of whom, unfortunately, are left to die on that long and dangerous journey from their home. We're well aware of their drug trafficking operation, which brings all sort of illegal drugs into the United States. And over the years, law enforcement has interdicted everything from marijuana to methamphetamine to cocaine and heroin. But recently, we've seen an alarming rise of fentanyl. When I was in Mexico City just a couple of weeks ago, visiting with the Drug Enforcement Administration, they said fentanyl is made from chemicals that are imported from China to Mexico, where the cartels simply mix them up and then put them through a industrial-sized pill press and make it look like regular prescription drugs, although these are laced with fentanyl, a deadly drug in very, very small amounts. We know a lot of communities throughout Texas and throughout the country have experienced waves of deaths caused by unintentional fentanyl poisoning. In other words, the person taking the pill, usually a teenager, thinks they're taking something innocuous that won't kill them, certainly. They may think they're taking anything from a painkiller or other sorts of prescription drugs, and then they unknowingly ingest a lethal dose of fentanyl. And of course, the cartels continue to get rich, and the destruction caused by these overdoses and drug abuse continue. But we know that these cartels, again, are commodity agnostic. They just don't traffic in drugs. They also prey on vulnerable people who want to come to the United States. They spin a web of lies and false promises to convince migrants to make the journey to our border under their care. But like all other things that the cartel deals in, it comes at a price. And there are a lot of factors that determine how much it costs somebody to make their way to our front doorstep on our southern border. Typically, it's thousands of dollars a head, but really it just depends on where you're coming from. Because recently in Yuma, Arizona, a sleepy little agricultural community, the Border Patrol chief welcomed a bipartisan delegation of senators there and said, "We've encountered people who speak 200 languages from 176 countries in this sleepy little ag community." Senator Mark Kelly from Arizona said, well, in all likelihood, people are flying into Mexicali, which is a city in northern Mexico, and then simply calling an Uber and making their way to the border and then claiming asylum, only to be released by the Biden administration into the interior of the country. Those are the lucky ones. Those who turn themselves over to the coyotes, the human smugglers, frequently end up dead. We all remember last June when a tractor-trailer rig smuggled migrants in San Antonio. It was found abandoned in sweltering conditions. 53 people died, trapped in the back of that truck. Those that did survive often arrived malnourished or abused. Many women and men are injured or otherwise abused. Many women and girls are raped along the way. Some arrive pregnant. As we know, the customers of these criminal organizations aren't limited to Mexican or Central American citizens. These are international criminal networks. Last year, consistent with what the Yuma Border Patrol chief told us, last year, Customs and Border Protection encountered migrants from 174 countries. People from every corner of the globe are traveling to Mexico and crossing the U.S. southern border, all in the tender care of these transnational criminal organizations. Of course, given the nature of this business, it's tough to estimate just how much the cartels are making from their human smuggling operations. But last year, Homeland Security investigations estimated that the cartels were making roughly $13 billion a year just from migrant smuggling alone. And there's no question that their success is built on a breakdown of enforcement by the Biden administration. If our border was truly secure, if people knew that they would not be able to just enter our country willy-nilly, but had to follow legal pathways, the cartels wouldn't be able to flood the zone with migrants to clear the way for their smuggling operations. Unfortunately, instead of making the cartel's job harder, the Biden administration's policy of open borders just keeps making it easier. Rather than secure the border and enforce our laws, the Biden administration continues to send a message loud and clear that our border is open for anyone to come across. For more than 2 years, the administration has refused to enforce the law, ensuring that the cartel's illicit gateways remain wide open. They've released hundreds of thousands of migrants into the United States, some of whom will wait as long as 10 years before they can even begin the immigration court process. Talk about a major pull factor. If someone is on the fence about making the dangerous journey to the United States but sees that virtually anybody that shows up is able to stay in the United States for a decade at least, even before facing an immigration judge, their decision to come is far easier. As though the cartels don't have enough business already, they're about to be given the gift of a lifetime when Title 42 ends in 6 weeks on May 11th. Title 42, of course, is a public health law which has given the Border Patrol one tool to deter and to return migrants out of the country. It's given the Department of Homeland Security the ability to quickly expel migrants and prevent our border facilities and local communities from becoming even more overwhelmed than they already are. But once it disappears, in May, the floodgates will be wide open. Law enforcement and border communities have been bracing for the migration surge that's sure to come once Title 42 goes away. They're worried that they don't have the people, the facilities, or resources to manage this flood of humanity. And the administration has done zero to inspire confidence. Just last week, Secretary Mayorkas visited El Paso, which has been at the epicenter of this crisis since late last year. The streets and the shelters have been filled with vulnerable migrants with nowhere else to go. And its leaders are very anxious about what will happen on May 11th. During his visit, Secretary Mayorkas met with Border Patrol agents and Customs and Border Protection Office of Field Operations officers to thank them for their hard work. These men and women have been on the front lines of this crisis for more than 2 years, and they deserve our unending gratitude for the sacrifices they made. But they deserve more than our thanks. They deserve our help so that they can do the law enforcement and do the job that they have pledged to do. But we've designed the system to fail because we've made it impossible for them to do their job the way they're trained to do. Well, Secretary Mayorkas couldn't be bothered to meet with other stakeholders in El Paso. He might have actually learned something. When I visited the city in January with a bipartisan group, we took the time to meet with law enforcement, local elected officials, business owners, non-governmental organizations, and many others. And they told us about the strain this crisis had placed on the entire community. And they shared their fears about what might happen once Title 42 is lifted if there's no alternative plan put in place. Unfortunately, during his most recent trip, Secretary Mayorkas didn't take the time to hear from a full range of stakeholders who are on the front lines. He didn't sit down with those elected officials to discuss the caravans of migrants that are forming just across the border in Juarez, across from El Paso. He didn't offer advice about how the communities should prepare for what happens when Title 42 is eliminated, or what the federal government was prepared to do to help. So once again, Our border communities in Texas are doing the backbreaking work of managing this crisis with little or no support from the Biden administration. With the end of Title 42 in sight, the administration needs to prepare for what's to come, and they need to help get ready to deter this huge flood of humanity. They simply can't ignore the problem and hope it goes away. That hadn't worked for the last 2 years, and it certainly won't work now. March is quickly coming to a close, and the challenges are only going to grow from there. As the spring months are typically some of the busiest for migration, that's because mild temperatures make the journey a little less dangerous, and folks want to come to the United States, many to work during the summertime. Our border communities are bracing for this perfect storm of policies and circumstances that will hurt everybody except the cartels. Their drugs trafficking and human smuggling have never been more profitable, and they're gearing up for an even bigger windfall thanks to the Biden administration and the end of Title 42. These criminal organizations will continue to extort and profit off the backs of vulnerable migrants. They'll coordinate migration surges to distract and overwhelm law enforcement, and they'll smuggle fentanyl and other dangerous drugs into every corner of this country. And they'll get richer while migrants and communities throughout America suffer. The administration has 6 weeks to come up with a plan. They know the clock is ticking, and they'd better get to work. And even more significantly, they ought to work with us on a bipartisan basis to come up with a solution. Senator Sinema from Arizona and I, Henry Cuellar, a Democrat from Laredo, Tony Gonzalez, a Republican from the largest border district in the country, the four of us introduced a bill called the Bipartisan Border Safety Act. We did that almost 2 years ago, and yet our Democratic colleagues, even though they've had the majority for two years preceding this last election, did nothing to have hearings on that proposed legislation or to offer a markup or vote on that bill. And certainly we were happy if somebody had a better idea to come forward, but all we heard were crickets. Well, the clock is ticking, and we know what's going to happen in May unless something changes, and I hope it will.